I'm going to be revisiting an army that I've had for a really long time. And I'm going to show you how to use seasons to inspire your paint scheme. I'm going to be using fall or autumn.
And I'm going to be trying out winter. It's tabletop time.
So I started collecting Sylvaneth back when they were first released. Originally, I actually wanted the Wood Elves, but they got discontinued. Then they brought out a new army for Age of Sigmar, the Sylvaneth, which also consisted of the most awesome model I had ever seen, Alarielle. But Sylvaneth are typically painted in what I perceive to be a summer or spring theme, and I decided I wanted to see what they would look like if they were in autumn. So Games Workshop have kindly sent us the Blades of Belthanos box, and I am very excited to open this up. I think this is such a cool model with the beetle and Belthanos on top, so I really want to see what this looks like in an autumn scheme. But first, let's check out the new model and then we'll move on to painting.
So when this Dawnbringer's box got announced, I was pretty excited. I'd already painted up Alarielle, and so I thought the Belthanos would be a really good contrast to have as well. It looked like a beautifully sculpted model, and it was also big, which is a scale I just prefer to work with. The Blades of Belthanos box comes with a couple of other pieces, including 3 Kurnoth Hunters with bows, 3 Revenant Seekers, and Belthanos himself. Now, as any Sylvaneth army collector knows, everything in here is gorgeously detailed, and you know you're gonna make some stunning miniatures here. So a quick check over on the box and making sure everything is here and in place. It's time to get started with the build. Now Belthanos and his beetle are all on one sprue, so I didn't have to go back and forth trying to find all the pieces. I will say, however, he was a little bit tricky to make. There were a few pieces that slotted into awkward places rather than just being a simple connection. The instructions helped a little bit, but there were a few times I was a little confused and just needed to fiddle around with the model. This means that you want to make sure you're dry fitting your model first, just to make sure you know where the pieces go. But overall, this kind of allows the seam lines to be hidden really cleverly in the design. While building these, I also decided to keep Belthanos and his scarab separate so I could paint them up individually. And once my models were all built, I left these to dry and I decided to move on to the basing. So Belthanos and his beetle are all done, so these are still drying a little bit, so I'm going to leave those to the side, and I'm going to start working on his base. Now, this is a pretty good coverage area, so I feel like I can really tell a story on this base. As I mentioned before, I'm going to use an autumn paint scheme like I have for the rest of my Sylvaneth, and also incorporate this into the base. So the first thing I need to do is build just a little bit of foundation on here, and then I can add some flocks and really turn it into a gorgeous autumn scene. So let's add some corkboard and some texture paste, and then we can get to flocking. So before I can add that autumn feel to my base, I need to establish a very clear foundation. This means establishing the area that Belthanos will be standing in, creating some undulation with some hills and rocks. We can do this really easily with some corkboard and then just some texture paste on top to bring it all together. Once this is all done, I gave it a super quick dry brush so we could start adding our flock on top. And speaking of adding flock and making your bases come to life, what better sponsor today than All Game Terrain? That's right, you can make awesome bases just like this one using All Games Terrain awesome scenic stuff for your bases. They have all kinds of stuff, lugs, rocks, this, that, everything else in between. Also can't forget their water effects, and the best part of all is I don't even have to paint them. And neither do you. So go check out All Game Terrain, links are down in the description below. So if you're someone who wants to make an army in a particular season, all you need to do is think about the colors that would represent that season. So for example, summer reminds me a lot of yellow and even the color blue. Spring reminds me of the color pink and green, and winter very much the blue color spectrum, maybe even opting into purple. But it's all up for interpretation, and I think the thing that really establishes a season to a Warhammer army is all in the basing. So to kick things off, the first thing I needed to do was lay down my primer. I decided to spray Belthanos and his bug both black, just so I could make the base colors really pop later on. Also, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing his name right, Belthanos. I'm sure however you want to pronounce it, either way works fine. Now, I really wanted to get started with the bug that Belthanos is standing on. It's a really cool miniature, and I really wanted to get started on it, so I decided to pick him first, working up in different tones of red, but still keeping in with that warm theme. I used an airbrush to put on the various layers of red. I knew that I want this color to be the undertone of the entire bug, so it was okay if I got it everywhere and I'd paint over the top later. When it came to Belthanos himself, I wanted to keep him in the brown spectrum, again using warmer tones rather than cool. A lot of the Sylvaneth models have something in their tummy, and in Belthanos' case he does too. So I gave it a quick spray of a cream color so I could glaze a yellow on top a bit later on. Once I was happy with all of my airbrushing and spraying, I could move on to hand painting. So the first thing I wanted to do with both models was lay down some washes. Washes just give me that little bit of depth I think I need when I feel like the airbrushing effect has made it all very matte and flat. So I washed both the Scarab and Belthanos in their chosen colours and left these to dry. After that, I got to work on the Scarab. Now this beetle has some absolutely gorgeous raised edges, and I really wanted to pick these out with a dry brush. Again, keeping with that autumn mixture of red, orange and yellow, and working my way up to the brightest colour, which in this case would be yellow. Once all my dry brushing was done, I went over the top with an even brighter yellow just to really pick out those pinpoint highlights. The next part of the process was to start breaking up the beetle in different colour blocks. He has a lot of red on him, so I wanted to introduce another colour that could visually block this out a bit better. The best areas for this for a beetle are kind of the squishy areas, which is his underside and his neck area. Representing a more fleshy texture, I painted these in a yellow to a pale cream colour, trying to create a sort of feathered texture that you would see on some bugs, particularly in moths or caterpillars, where it looks like they'd be quite soft to the touch. Also went ahead and did just some pinpoint highlights just to really make these areas pop. I then started working on Belthanos. So fall, or autumn as we call it in Australia, is one of my favourite seasons. There's just something about the way that the trees look and the smell on the air that I absolutely love. Not to mention it's also a little bit chillier, which is so much better than the 40-degree summers we get in Australia. So I really wanted to find a way to incorporate that richness and that feel in my Sylvaneth army. So when we think about autumn, there's a couple of colours that come straight to mind. This particularly is seen in the leaves that fall on the ground. Red, orange and yellow are the three prominent colours that I think of when I think of autumn. So when it came to choosing what colours I would use, typically this warm palette would be what I'd opt for when I wanted to create my Sylvaneth army. There were a few caveats to this, however. In my older Sylvaneth models, I've actually used green as an option. However, where I've tried to use green, I've picked a more warmer toned green, blending its way into a yellow. The first thing I wanted to do was again create these colour block areas, separating his armour panels to the tree that's underneath. I wanted the underneath pieces to be more pale, so it kind of looks like bark has just been freshly pulled from a tree. So I painted these up in a lighter brown colour, but still keeping within that warm tone spectrum. Once I was happy with how this was looking, I went ahead and washed these areas as well. Now a lot of the Sylvaneth creatures have these awesome glowing runes on them as well, and I've always been super intimidated on how to do these, but I think I figured out a really good trick. All you need to do is grab your brush and apply a generous amount of water. Leave it for a couple of seconds so it really seeps into those recesses. When you're ready, grab your chosen colour paint and thin this down with some water. Then all you need to do is simply gently touch your brush to the watered areas and you should see this fill in really easily. You will have to let this dry and do this a good couple of times to really create that bright effect. But you don't need to worry too much about overspilling, because even if it does go over a little bit, it creates a nice glowing effect. Throughout my painting process, I went back and did this a couple of times, so eventually it got brighter and brighter.
So Jen has been doing an awesome job realizing autumn. I love how you've been creating it, and the change in your army scheme, these oranges, the yellows instead of the greens, I actually think works really well.
Yeah, I am really enjoying the process and I actually love how it's turning out.
This reminded me of how fun it can be to do other seasons. I have once painted Sylvaneth before. I actually started to do a theme for the Warhammer Underworlds warband, and instead of it being autumny, it was actually quite cold. It was a chilly winter. And I'm going to take you through how I did that, as well as a little aside to how you can use other seasons to completely change the feeling and vibe of your army.
I'm excited.
So these are some of my favorite Sylvaneth models. Yathari's Guardians from Warhammer Underworlds are really fantastic, but you can already see as we look at one I've already painted just how different the vibe is from what Jen's working on. I'm going to quickly paint through one of these models and talk about the decisions I make and how it brings a winterly vibe to a model and how you can use that in your own armies. So when we think about winter, we think about cold colors, which are typically blues. To capture most of the blues on this model, I wanted to use the spirit portions. Many of the Sylvaneth, as typically depicted on box art, do have this etheric blue spirit vibe, but I wanted to take that to the next step. So to do that, I highlighted up to far more severe whites, leaving these really dark blues in the shading areas. The combination of the idea of the dark blues of winter with these bright winter whites really helps to sell an Arctic aesthetic rather than necessarily a spiritual one. The Sylvaneth are of course tree spirits, woodlands. And when we look at woodlands in winter areas, one thing I've noticed is quite a lot of desaturation of color. So the woods I want to use, the browns, are a real gray brown, very dark and devoid of a lot of color saturation. These very subtle dry brushes on these woods, staying away from any oranges or warm colors. I want this to look like cold wood or dead wood. Now, of course, the Sylvaneth are modeled with vines and colored leaves, so I didn't want to ignore these elements. Rather than looking towards the idea of dead leaves or fallen leaves, as these are spirits of life, I decided to incorporate leaf colors that were appropriate for winter areas. You'll notice a theme in winter paint schemes of a lot of dark colors, so when we include greens, we want to include greens inspired by things like dark pine trees that exist in alpine and snowy areas. Even when highlighting these, I don't use any of the yellow tinges that we might often do. To give a real vibrant sense of life with leaves, it can often help to put some yellow in our greens in the highlighting step. But as this is winter theme, we really want to avoid that, minimizing the amount of yellow we use and simply introducing lighter tones of the same dark green. With all these elements in place, there is a little bit of a mismatch. The bright white spirit body combined with the dark browns and greens of the rest of it needs to be uplifted somehow. And the way we do that was with snow effects on the base and gently dappled around the model. This helps the eye move across the model and really draws it towards the focal areas, which are the exposed elements of the Sylvaneth tree spirit. When painting your own winter themes and incorporating that season, I'd encourage you to think of the color theory around keeping everything tonally cold, trying not to include reds and yellows, and also keeping things muted, but then contrasting it with hard splashes of blues and whites. Now, the bases of the Underworld models are pre-designed, so I had no decisions to make here. But when creating alpine bases, it's important to consider whether the area has snowfall or not, and if it does have snowfall, how recent, how heavy, or how deep it is. I will confess it's not something we're particularly familiar with here in Australia. From a hobby point of view, it is important to think about these things. For example, models in the dead of winter will often consist of dark brown, rotted or covered undergrowth with a hefty whack of snow on top of them, maybe with some branches poking through the snow, adding points of detail. Whereas something at the break of winter might include fresh blooms and green grasses starting to push through, a lighter covering of snow, and a bit more melt off and run water. If nothing else, I think my models have shown how you can take the Sylvaneth in completely different ways by using different seasons. And I'd love to hear from you how you view seasons on different armies other than these lovely treeple.
Onto some metallics, I decided this time around I wasn't going to attempt non-metallic metal and instead opting for scale color paints instead. They have a really beautiful elven gold which worked perfectly for this paint scheme. Now on the back of Belthanos he has a cape full of leaves and I needed to paint these up in an autumn scheme. So I laid down a couple of colors first, kind of making it look like a modeled mess, but then going over the top a bit later with some dry brushing to make these pop. With autumn leaves, typically they're yellow in the middle, grading out to a red towards the end. I kind of forgot this halfway through, but decided that I wanted him to have a mixture of colored leaves all over his cape. Another thing I decided to change from my original Sylvaneth army was Belthanos' weapon. Originally I had painted my weapons in a green color because I thought they looked really cool, but instead I wanted to try for a yellow. And I thought that this paint scheme looked way better than the green. The green gave off a springtime kind of feel, while the yellow feels like it's more inspired by fall colors. Once I was happy with how everything was looking, I just went ahead and added more highlights to everything, just elevating the entire paint job up a level. And with my base all finished and ready to go, I was ready to glue everything together and call this model done. huge thank you to all of our patrons who support us over on Patreon. It's because of our patrons that we can make awesome videos like this one, and I have had an absolute joy painting Belthanos and his bug boy up. If you'd like to consider joining, there are links down in the description below, and you can get some awesome monthly perks just for being a member. So thank you again to all of our patrons.
Thank you all so much for watching. That's pretty much it. I really hope you enjoyed this process. I have a lot more Sylvaneth to paint up before I have a full army, so if you'd like to see that process, let us know in the comments below.
You did such a great job, Jen. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Well done. I love seeing your Sylvaneth come to life. Spider.